19th century headlines describe giants unearthed across America. Modern institutions say they never existed. Both cannot be true. Some connect the disappearances to Tartaria. We're reopening the file. Subscribe and tell me what you think really happened. The file does not begin in ancient Tartaria. It begins in 19th century America. When I started digging, I expected vague folklore. Instead, I found headlines, real ones, archived, scanned, preserved. In 1833, newspapers in Ohio described the excavation of burial mounds containing unusually large skeletons. Reports claimed skulls of extraordinary size. In 1895, the New York World published a story about giant bones found near Crittenden, Arizona. The article described skeletons over 8 feet tall, accompanied by strange artifacts. These weren't blog posts, they were printed ink. Through the Library of Congress archive, chronicling America, you can still read dozens of similar reports between 1850 and 1910. Kentucky, Wisconsin, West Virginia, Indiana. The pattern repeats. Mound opened, oversized skeleton found, measurements described, then silence. This is where the modern claim begins. According to Tartaria researchers, these weren't isolated exaggerations. They were remnants of a forgotten civilization, sometimes called Tartaria, whose guardians were giants. Protectors, builders, a race erased when history was rewritten in the 19th century. The theory claims 3 things. First, giant human skeletons were commonly discovered across North America. Second, institutions, particularly the Smithsonian, confiscated and destroyed the remains. Third, these giants were linked to a global empire that does not appear in modern textbooks. When I map the claims chronologically, something interesting happens. The giant reports peak during a very specific era, the American mound excavation boom. In the late 1800s, settlers were systematically digging into Native American burial mounds across the Midwest. Archaeology was chaotic. Standards were loose. Sensationalism sold papers. But the descriptions in these articles are oddly consistent. 7 feet tall, 8 feet tall, skull twice the normal size. Some reports even mention double rows of teeth. Double rows of teeth. That detail appears again and again. It becomes a marker in modern Tartaria forums. A sign that the skeletons were not just tall humans, but something different. At this stage of the investigation, I resisted jumping ahead. The point isn't to dismiss. The point is to catalog. So I built a simple list. 1833, Ohio mound, oversized skeleton reported. 1871, Wisconsin excavation, skull of unusual thickness described. 1895, Arizona article claiming 8-foot remains. 1902, West Virginia mound with giant proportions. Each article follows the same structure: discovery, measurement, excitement, then nothing further. No museum catalog numbers, no preserved specimen photos, no follow-up studies. That absence becomes fuel for the Tartaria narrative. If the bones were real, where did they go? The Guardians of Tartaria concept emerges much later, in 20th and 21st century reinterpretations of these newspaper stories. The idea suggests these giants were elite protectors of a technologically advanced empire, Tartaria, supposedly erased from maps after the 1800s. When I searched 19th century documents for the word Tartaria connected to these skeletons, I found nothing. The original articles never mention it. That linkage appears to be retrospective, a modern stitching together of 2 separate threads. giant skeleton reports, and alternative empire theories. But that does not erase the core question. Why were so many giant skeleton stories printed across decades? Were they hoaxes, measurement errors, tall individuals misreported as monstrous, or something else? At this stage, the file is still open, because the claim does not rest on a single article. It rests on volume, on repetition, on the strange uniformity of language, and on the silence that follows. No preserved giants in modern museum collections, no verified 8-foot skeletons in university archives, no peer-reviewed anthropological confirmation. The believers argue that absence proves suppression. The skeptics argue that absence proves exaggeration. I close the first folder with one realization. The story of the giants does not start with bones.
It starts with newspapers.
And newspapers in the 1800s were not neutral record keepers. But before we can decide whether the guardians of Tartaria were erased or invented, we have to follow the paper trail forward. The file does not end in the mounds. It moves into institutions. I shifted from headlines to records. If giant skeletons were systematically found across the Midwest, they would have entered institutional archives. Excavations, even chaotic ones, leave traces. Donation logs, correspondence, shipping manifests, museum catalog entries. So, I followed the paper. The Smithsonian Institution began formal mound investigations in the late 1800s under the Bureau of American Ethnology. Cyrus Thomas led one of the largest surveys of burial mounds ever conducted in the United States. His final 1894 report spans hundreds of pages. Measurements, drawings, burial descriptions, skeletal analysis. I read through sections carefully. There are tall individuals documented, 6.5 feet, occasionally near 7. But there are no confirmed 8-foot skeletons, no anatomical anomalies suggesting a separate race, no double rows of teeth. That detail, the double teeth, is particularly important. In modern Tartaria discussions, it appears constantly. Yet, in osteological literature, what is often described in newspapers as double rows can correspond to supernumerary teeth, a known but rare dental condition. It does not indicate a separate species. Next, I searched museum accession records. Institutions catalog human remains meticulously. Even in the 19th century, curators kept notes. If dozens of giant skeletons were collected, there would be at least fragmented inventory trails. Instead, I found something different. Many 19th century articles cite unnamed local doctors or curious citizens. Very few reference credentialed archaeologists. Measurements are often approximate. Over 7 feet, nearly 8 feet. Rarely exact numbers like 7 feet 11 inches. The language feels inflated. Sensationalism was not uncommon in that era. Newspapers competed aggressively. Hoaxes circulated widely. The Cardiff Giant in 1869, a fabricated 10-foot stone petrified man, fooled thousands and was widely reported as authentic before being exposed. That event alone proves the appetite for giant narratives was strong, but appetite does not equal evidence. Then I tracked something else: retractions. Several mound-related stories published in small-town papers were quietly corrected weeks later, stating the skeleton was mismeasured or fragmentary. Those corrections rarely traveled beyond the original locality. The sensational headline did. This creates a distortion effect in historical memory. The dramatic claim survives in archives. The correction fades. I also examined anthropological consensus. By the early 20th century, physical anthropology had developed standardized measurement protocols. Extensive skeletal collections exist from Native American mound sites. Average male height ranges between approximately 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 9 inches, depending on region and period. Outliers exist, as in any population, but not a consistent race of 8-foot individuals. No peer-reviewed excavation report confirms a population of giants. At this stage, I faced a fork. Either the institutions were complicit in systematic removal, or the original reports were unreliable. The suppression hypothesis requires coordination. Multiple universities, federal bureaus, regional museums, decades of silence, no whistleblowers with documentation, no surviving catalog fragments showing destroyed 8-foot remains. The exaggeration hypothesis requires something simpler: human error amplified by competitive journalism. I returned to the archive database and compared wording patterns. Phrases like astonishing discovery, gigantic proportions, race of giants appear repeatedly across different states, sometimes nearly identical in structure.
It begins to look less like independent confirmation and more like narrative recycling.
Still, one detail kept resurfacing in Tartaria forums: the claim that Smithsonian representatives physically removed skeletons from local sites. So, I searched correspondence collections. Letters between field collectors and the Bureau of American Ethnology are preserved. They discuss crate shipments, artifact transfers, even broken bones. But nowhere did I find reference to extraordinary 8-foot remains being destroyed. What I did find were bureaucratic frustrations, damaged remains, poor preservation, incomplete skeletons. In some cases, bones crumbled during excavation. 19th century preservation methods were primitive. This introduces a quieter explanation for disappearance: fragility. Not all bones survive transport. Not all finds are monumental. But the silence after the headlines remains psychologically powerful. It leaves room for interpretation, and in that room, the idea of guardians grows. The file now splits into two directions. One path follows anthropology, the other follows accusation. And that accusation has a name: Smithsonian. The accusation sounds simple. The Smithsonian destroyed the giants. In almost every modern Tartaria discussion, the narrative sharpens at this point. The newspaper reports were real. The bones were real.
And when federal institutions grew powerful in the late 19th century, they allegedly confiscated and eliminated the evidence to preserve an approved version of history. It is a powerful claim. It gives the silence a villain. So I looked for something specific: documentation of destruction. In 2014, articles began circulating online claiming that the Smithsonian had admitted in court to destroying thousands of giant skeletons in the early 1900s. The story referenced a lawsuit supposedly won by the American Institution of Alternative Archaeology. According to the viral posts, a U.S. Supreme Court ruling forced the Smithsonian to release classified documents proving systematic destruction. It sounds definitive, but when I searched the Supreme Court database, there was no such case. No ruling, no docket entry, no archived opinion matching the description. The American Institution of Alternative Archaeology also has no established legal presence, no IRS filings, no academic registry. It appears to originate from a satirical website called World News Daily Report, which has published fictional stories presented in a news format. The 2014 article was satire.
That discovery matters because this single fabricated story became a cornerstone in the accusation narrative. Screenshots of the fake court ruling are still shared widely. The satire disclaimer rarely travels with them.
But removing that article does not erase the suspicion entirely.
So I went deeper. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology collected thousands of human remains during legitimate archaeological expeditions. This is documented. It is not hidden. Many of those remains were later subject to repatriation under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, passed in 1990. Under NAGPRA, institutions must return culturally affiliated remains to descendant communities. This process involves detailed inventories. If thousands of 8-foot skeletons existed in federal collections, they would appear in repatriation logs. They do not. Repatriation records describe remains consistent with known indigenous populations. There is no catalog category labeled giant. The accusation then shifts to another angle, destruction without record. But institutional destruction leaves traces too: internal memos, budget allocations, facility logs. Even classified operations create paperwork. Especially in the early 20th century, when bureaucracy was expanding, not shrinking. To erase thousands of anomalous skeletons would require coordination across multiple curators and decades of secrecy. It would require the compliance of independent scholars who examined collections. It would require no surviving photographs, no preserved fragments, no whistleblower correspondence.
The scale becomes the question.
Could small numbers of misidentified remains have been discarded due to poor preservation? Absolutely. Early archaeology was not careful by modern standards. Could thousands of giants have been systematically eliminated without a single verified document surfacing in over a century? That requires a different level of orchestration. When I reviewed correspondence archives between field agents and the Smithsonian, the tone is bureaucratic, sometimes mundane. Crates delayed, specimens damaged, measurements corrected. There is no language suggesting extraordinary concealment, and yet the accusation persists because it solves the psychological gap created in Part 1. If newspapers printed giants and museums do not display them, then someone must have intervened. The human mind resists unfinished stories. But the evidence for deliberate institutional destruction rests largely on repetition within online communities rather than archival confirmation. The 2014 satire case demonstrates how quickly a fabricated document can solidify into belief when it aligns with an existing suspicion. Still, I resisted final judgment, because the absence of proof is not automatically proof of absence. But in historical investigation, scale matters, patterns matter, paperwork matters. And so far, every verified document points toward exaggerated journalism and fragile remains, not a federal purge. Yet the legend of the Guardians does not depend solely on bones. It depends on something larger. The idea that an entire civilization, Tartaria, was removed from maps. And that accusation moves beyond skeletons. By the time I reached this point, the file had grown heavier, not because of bones, because of patterns. The Guardians of Tartaria narrative survives even when individual pieces collapse. Remove the fake 2014 lawsuit, the belief remains. Question the newspaper exaggerations, the suspicion persists. The strength of the idea does not come from one artifact. It comes from structure. So I stepped back. First pattern, timing.
The surge of giant skeleton stories aligns almost perfectly with the 19th century excavation boom. It also aligns with the peak era of sensational print journalism. Newspapers regularly amplified extraordinary claims to drive circulation. Sea serpents, airships, hidden civilizations. Giants fit neatly into that ecosystem. Second pattern, language recycling. When comparing articles across states, phrasing repeats with uncanny similarity. Race of giants, astonishing proportions, skull of unusual thickness. These are not clinical descriptions. They are narrative cues. Once one paper published the template, others followed it. Third pattern, the silence effect. The headline travels, the correction does not. The find is described dramatically. The follow-up measurement, if it ever happened, rarely receives the same space. Over decades, this creates an archive filled with initial excitement but stripped of resolution. Into that silence, modern interpretation flows. Now the Tartaria layer. Historical maps from the 16th to 18th centuries often label large regions of Central Asia as Tartaria. This was a broad geographic term used by European cartographers, not the name of a unified technological empire. Over time, as geographic knowledge became more precise, the label disappeared from maps, replaced by specific political entities. But in online communities, that cartographic shift is reframed as erasure. Combine that with the mound narratives and something powerful forms. An ancient empire, a race of giants, a coordinated institutional purge. It is narratively elegant. But elegance is not evidence. When I searched 19th century anthropological literature for references to Tartaria connected to American mound builders, I found none. The two concepts occupy different historical conversations. Their fusion appears modern. The Guardians motif, protectors of a hidden empire, adds mythic coherence. Every civilization story benefits from scale. Giants provide scale. They amplify mystery. They justify monumental architecture. They personalize loss. The absence of physical 8-foot skeletons becomes proof not of exaggeration but of concealment. The more complete the institutional archives appear, the more some interpret them as curated. This is the final pattern: inversion. Evidence becomes suspect. Silence becomes proof. Documentation becomes manipulation. In that framework, no amount of archived reports will satisfy the claim, because the system itself is assumed compromised. That is not unique to Tartaria. It is a recurring structure in many alternative history movements. But here is what remains solid after months of cross-checking. 19th century newspapers did publish numerous giant skeleton stories. Archaeological institutions did collect thousands of remains. Standardized anthropological reports do not confirm a race of 8-foot humans. The 2014 Supreme Court destruction story was satire. The term Tartaria on historical maps does not indicate a lost global superpower. None of this is mystical. It is administrative. The story of the Guardian survives because it fills emotional gaps left by incomplete records and dramatic headlines. It offers scale where history feels fragmented. It offers agency where archives feel sterile. And yet, the file does not close with ridicule. It closes with a reminder. History in the 1800s was messy. Journalism was competitive. Archaeology was evolving. Preservation was fragile. That combination produces noise. Sometimes noise sounds like giants. If the Guardians of Tartaria existed as a biological race, the evidence would require coordinated global suppression across centuries, continents, and independent institutions.
That scale leaves traces. So far, the trace we consistently find is human storytelling. Not ghosts, not erased titans. Paper and patterns. The file remains open to new documents. But until bones appear in verified collections with verified measurements, the weight of the record leans toward exaggeration amplified by repetition. The Guardians were not removed from history. They were built inside it.